My male teammates, if they have a child, they don't lose out on performance bonuses for 18 months to 2 years. They don't lose out on an ability to race or train or travel. They might cut back to support their partner, to be a dad, to help raise a small child, but they can race. They can get those bonuses versus my female teammates, right? Who, you're pregnant for 9-ish months, you're recovering for a year-ish, depending on how things go. That's basically 2 years of not being able to make any of your performance bonuses. So you might still get your retainer, but you might lose out on 50% of the value of your contract potentially. We would like to start a family next year. Have no idea if or how or when that's going to happen. What that means, though, is that when I'm looking at a fall race, I was really trying to check more than one box, keep a Western States qualifier going, keep a UTMB qualifier going, in part because I wanted to benefit from the pregnancy deferral policies. We happen to hit the prime of so many things all at once. Our prime athletic years, our prime child rearing years, our prime career years are all in the same 15-year window.
Welcome to the Blue Rose Podcast, your dose of confidence to live a bold life. Here I share insights from my own journey and dive into the stories of individuals in the outdoors and athletics who are fiercely getting after life. I'm your host, Becca Blue Rose.
So my name is Corrine Malcolm, and at this point, I like to think that I'm kind of a jack of all trades. There isn't a great way to define what I do exactly when it comes to career, job, sport, etc. But I think that's a great thing. I run professionally for Adidas Terex. I run a podcast called Trail Society. I do a lot of live commentary for the sport of trail and ultra running. I'm part of what we are calling the Women's Trail Running Fund, which is specifically raising money for grants to try to tell more stories in trail and ultra running and endurance sports in general. So we launched t-shirt campaigns this summer at Western States, an online store, and now more recently at UTMB. And we're about to launch our steering committee internally, which is very exciting. I coach runners as well. I'm a dog mom. I live in Seattle, Washington, and I'm constantly running from one thing to the next, basically.
Yeah, I imagine that's a lot to keep together. But how did you get into running? Let's start there.
Yeah, so I grew up in northern Wisconsin, where being a three sport athlete was kind of just the norm, if not highly, highly encouraged by both my parents and our school district. So I was a soccer player. I ran cross country. I picked up cross country skiing, and then I ran track and field. But really, I thought I was a track and field girly. I did not have an endurance bone in my body. I was a 400-meter runner at the long distance, more of a 200, 400 high jumper. And endurance sports had to build and come up from there. But fell in love with cross country skiing, and it turns out you can't ski in the summer, and you do a lot of trail running to get ready for winter season. And that really, I think, grew my love for both cross country running and then just trail running and endurance sports in general. Ended up going out to college in Bozeman, Montana at Montana State. And there, the coach sold me immediately because she was like, well, every Saturday we do a 4-hour run in the mountains for our long endurance session of the week. And I was like, I'm done. I'm in. Sign me up. I'll bring snacks. And that, when I left skiing eventually, trail running and ultra running was a natural fit because I've been doing 4 to 6 hour runs with snacks in the mountains for a decade at that point. So it's kind of one thing led to the other, but grew up athletic, grew up competitive, grew up playing outside. And that has turned into a lifelong love of getting to do that stuff.
When did you start wanting to compete and become a professional runner? How I actually don't know the process of becoming a professional runner. How does that even work?
Yeah, I feel like it's a lot of right time, right place, right people for sure. I've had good people in
Mhm.
my corner because there are plenty of talented runners out there who are not on contracts for sure. Who, in a different place or time or with the right connection, that could very much change for them. But essentially, when I retired from biathlon, so shooting and skiing, I wanted to race a series of races. So I signed up for what was at that point in time the U.S. Skyrunning Series. So the Rut in Bozeman, or in Big Sky, Montana, Flagstaff Sky Peaks, a race out in Washington that's no longer going on called the Crystal Mountain Sky Marathon, to compete in a series that was established and kind of put together a chunk of results. And so showed up to these races, did pretty well. And that kind of gradually became getting picked up by the Solomon North American team. Continued to raced for Team USA at Worlds, just kind of like continuing to step up both in distance and kind of showing up to really competitive races. And ultimately that led to 6 years ago signing with Adidas Terrex. They were looking to build out their team. They're looking to add more North Americans to the team at the time. The manager loved that I came from a skiing background and that I was a coach. So beyond my running, liked what I was doing kind of in sport in general. And, had just enough results and was building kind of place for myself in the community that spoke to them. And it's been, 6 years at this point, which is kind of crazy to think that, I don't know. I feel like I just signed with them yesterday, but it's not the case. But yeah, it's a little bit of like right
Mhm.
time, right place. So results are important, but also who you are as a person, kind of what you're bringing to the team, what niche you're filling for them, because, every team kind of is looking for specific characters in a lot of ways. And so I checked enough of those boxes effectively that I ended up finding myself a spot.
Okay, so as an athlete, like on a team, do you get paid or are you just like, do you get gear? How does that work? And is it different for men and women, or do you have the same like contracts, I guess,
Totally.
essentially?
So it's a little bit dependent on it's dependent a little bit on brand, and it's also dependent a little bit on, is it a kind of a national ambassador program versus like a global team setup. I'm on what's called the Adidas Terrex Global Trail Team. So it's like a full on sponsored team in the sense that we are all paid a retainer. So, X amount of money that we get paid annually plus a bonus structure, which is awesome. So you perform well, you get extra money. Or a lot of our bonus structures include like social engagement, working in different media facets, community events, etc. So kind of getting a bonus for that time spent as well, along with like a travel stipend for races outside of our team camps and gear, like more gear than I ever know what to do with, actually, which is a great problem to have because at one point in time I was like, I just need shoes. Like, can someone give me shoes? Um, like that's a very real feeling, but there's definitely different tiers within that, and so there are athletes where, the tier that they're on is more or less product and maybe a little bit of travel help. Then I feel like the step up from that is be like developing a relationship in which you are getting paid a retainer. And those retainers vary widely. There are people on retainers that are probably $3,000 to $5,000 a year. And there are people in our sport or in the sport that I compete in that are on retainers that are, 70 to 100K a year. So there's a wide range in support out there. I would say that there are more people on the sub $10,000 a year retainer than there are getting close to six figures for sure. And then a smattering of people
Mhm.
in between. And so, and, and again, this goes brand to brand a little bit. A lot of teams are being held to and or are working towards gender pay disparities, like fixing gender pay disparities, because historically, yes, men in the sport have been sponsored more, a kind of a peer matched male versus female athlete. The male historically has been paid more, but that is changing brand to brand. I think as as obsolete contracts renew this year, a lot of contracts are renewing this year because 2020 contracts got pushed to 2021. Most of us are on a 3-year contract, so there are a lot of contracts up at the end of the season, actually. So we will see a lot of movement, which will be very exciting. And contracts that are probably 3 or 4 years old from like a how they were written standpoint are going to update in a big way. And so I do think that teams on accident almost have a gender pay gap right now because a new male athlete who got signed last year is probably getting paid significantly more than their kind of results matched like counterpart on a team who signed 3 or 4 years ago. So I do think that we'll see updates
Okay.
in that, but it is working towards um, eliminating that pay, like that gender pay disparity. But part of that also comes to like there's an elevation of the women's sport in general right now across sport, right? We're seeing it in trail and ultra running, but we're seeing it in
Mhm.
the National Women's Soccer League. We're seeing it in the WNBA. We're seeing it at the Paris Olympics. We're seeing kind of women's sport be elevated across with the Tour de Femmes, with road cycling is a great example of this too. And so as women's sports profile elevates in general, this all of a sudden has created, thankfully, a larger platform for women, like female athletes across the board to have a very good, like, can be like, hey, yo, like, we have to fix this. So there's more dollars being invested into women's sports than ever before, which will benefit athletes who are either new to contracts this year or who have contracts renewing this year.
So in my mind, right, like I follow like on social media, like I follow so many women in sports, right? So in my mind, I'm like, there's so many women in sports. Like all women do is participate in sports. And then like you hear the other side of it where like then it's still like, you know, I have a podcast like promoting women in sports. And then there's like movements to have more inclusivity in sports. So I guess like from your perspective, because you've been in the sport so long, like how has it changed? Because you say it's getting better, but like from an outside perspective, when I'm like looking at social media, like all I see is women in sports because that's what I pay attention
Yeah.
to. So it's kind of hard to see like where are those gaps that we need to be like paying attention to, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. From the like from where I sit, I work specifically within trail and ultra running, and I'm obviously very like female inclined as far as like wanting to hype up that field. So things that we're seeing change, right, are is the dialogue around women, is the want and the need to tell women's stories, by female creatives, by female videographers, having more women in the C-suite, having more women behind um, behind the computers in the studio that are helping to select for those images and those stories, for giving women a spot on the start line. I don't know if you've looked, I mean, I don't know, 9 out of 10 probably start line photos that you see from trail and ultra races is just a sea of men. So even like doing things that feel very performative, like, hey, we're actually going to divide the start line and we are going to have across the front of our start line, there's going to be, women on the right, men on the left, or vice versa. So that you can physically see women on the start line, because as races get longer, for example, and again, I spend a lot of time in like the ultra inside of ultra endurance, a lot of 100-mile races. Um, at the 5K, at the marathon, we're pretty close to 50-50 men, women participants. As you step up in distance, so 50K stays about 50-50, 50 miles, probably goes to 40-60. 100K all of a sudden is maybe 70-30. 100-mile can be 8 to 25% women versus, down at the marathon where it might be 50-50. So if there's 2,500 people in the start line and only 10% of those are women, you can see how small of a pool of athletes that is all of a sudden, and how much more critical it
Mm-hmm.
is to make sure that that story isn't being lost, that the women's race isn't being lost in the sea of 2,000 plus men. And so working
Mm-hmm.
on the media side of things, those gaps include like um, making sure you're allocating cameras to the women's race, making sure it's not the front of the race and then the women's race, that it's the men's race and the women's race. And we are looking to share both those stories, as opposed to it being like we're following the first runner of the race and maybe we'll go find the women's lead eventually. Really kind of like making
Mm.
sure that you've got a plan set up to cover both those stories accurately. I got to help out with the Mammoth Trail Fest this past weekend. Sunday was the Golden Trail World Series final, or like the last race of the series before they go to true finals next month. And they started the women's elite field, and anyone actually who had a ultra sign up score over 80%, any woman, could start in that elite field. So like I had a friend who was there doing the Triple Crown, and she was like, I think I'm going to start with them because I'm allowed to, and then I don't have to deal with like guys pushing me around. And she had the most like fantastic time because of it. Not getting stuck in a conga line of guys going slow on an uphill because they all sprinted out of the start. But what that also did for the media team is that it was so clear and so easy that we could follow the women's race, and then we could follow the men's race, and then we could follow both of them in conjunction with one another as they started to overlap, because the women started at 9:40 and the men started at 10 a.m. When you can find the women's race and see the women's race, then you can tell their stories in a way that elevates those women's profile. It elevates the sports profile. It elevates the brand's profile. The brands want to invest more into those athletes. They want to invest more into the sport, and it becomes this like story, or this kind of felt like self-fulfilling prophecy, positive return like system in which there's like this positive feedback loop. The other side of that is just you can't be what you don't see. And so there's the elite side of sport and sharing those stories, but it's also about sharing stories about anyone who's on the start line too. It's the first female finisher and the very last female finisher, and it's the mom who's got 3 kids, and it's the the someone from London who's a black trail runner, and they're getting out there for their first time ever, to do a trail race. It's sharing all those stories too, or at least being able to like share imagery of that, because all of a sudden it's like it might be hard to watch, like Rachel Drake or Anna Gibson, finish in the top 5 of a Golden Trail Series race. It might be hard to relate to them, but all of a sudden, the 52-year-old mom who's finishing and had a great run and is excited. You see the grit and determination and enthusiasm. You're like, oh, she can do that. I can do that. We had adaptive athletes out there over the weekend, which are like adaptive athletes are athletes, right? Like their story isn't inspiring because they're missing a leg. It's like they're inspiring because they're enthusiastic athletes, and they're like getting out there just like everyone else. But seeing those athletes out there and being like, oh, like someone else saying I'm an adaptive athlete, maybe I can do that too. So I think it's not just it's not obvious gaps oftentimes, but it's like from the back end, you see all these misses where you could be investing in the sport, and like it's good for business, it's good for the sport, it's kind of win-win for everyone to invest in the women's side of things.
Yeah, well, I've never thought about the fact like of starting races at different times, like the men's field and the women's field, because you do think of even like triathlon,
Mhm.
where like most of the time, especially at like local races, you're all starting together. You're starting with all age ranges, but like, is that common? I guess because like, so I did see your post like on Western States 100 that it was like 27% of
Mhm.
the field was women, but like everyone is starting
Yeah.
together, right? Like they're not starting separately. Do you think that that's something that you will start to see more
I
of?
think at the highest level of sport we will. We've got this kind of twofer, right? We've got this like um we've got a number of things happening. One, the races in the US are quite a bit smaller than a lot of the races in Europe, right? Western states, the starting field is
Mhm.
365 people, I think. So it's not the same as like all of a sudden starting on a start line of 3,000 people where it is a literal sea of humans out there. But I do think at the highest end of sport, we will see more of that in order to, particularly races that are being like televised or having a live broadcast around them. I think we will see some of that where it might be, a race like UTMB, for example, you could start the women anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours early. And that would allow you to kind of separate out those starts and separate the media teams from the beginning, having a complete division and kind of like how they're being covered in order to capture that imagery. I do think we're going to see more, but it's obviously way easier to do it in a 2 hour race where they're starting, 20 minutes apart. Everyone's going to finish before lunch effectively. Like that's a lot easier to do than a 100-mile race, than a big mountainous race. There are further complications when it comes to aid stations, volunteers, checkpoints, cutoffs, etc. But I do think that we're seeing it this year in like the Lifetime Grand Prix for gravel and gravel cycling and cross country mountain biking, because they kind of do a bit of both in that series. They this year, I think for every single Lifetime Grand Prix race, they gave the elite women their own start, and that has greatly changed the way the race plays out. Unbound gravel is like one of the biggest gravel cycling events in the world. Happens in Kansas every summer in early June. And this year, I think it was 9 women in a bunch sprint for the win, which is really cool. So basically, you had 9 women coming down the finishing stretch trying to get the win. And I talked to one of those gals,
Mhm.
and who's also an ultra runner, and I said like, Heather, how was like getting a separate start? And she's like, it was a night and day difference. Like their race was never impacted by a male athlete, was never influenced by a male athlete, either accidentally or intentionally. And it allowed the race to play out on its own as opposed to having any outside influence. And so cycling, obviously, other sports have a bit more to gain by other people being out there when it comes to drafting. We don't have that so much in trail and ultra running, but an example would be the race starts. I had people running CCC at UTMB finals, for example. A 100K race starts super fast. It gets to single track pretty quickly. And the front of the women's race, we're kind of in a bunch. But then you have a guy who maybe like passes 2 of them and cuts back in. And if he slows at all, he breaks the elastic from the first female to the second and third female. because they can't get around him. And so all
Mhm.
of a sudden, the first female has like quote unquote gotten away because there's versus like those females being uninterrupted, like they can see where they are the entire time, they know who's in their race, they know what position they're in the entire time, versus women's racing becoming a time trial. And this again, like there are benefits I think to the entire women's field if we did separate starts, but it most greatly impacts the very front of the race, and the elite field. And so there'd be reasons to do it for kind of the rest of the field too, but I think that the elite field gets the most benefit from it.
Yeah, no, that makes so much sense. I just did my first 50K, and I had like never experienced the like conga line of like climbing up a
Yeah.
mountain, but it truly was like for those first like 9 miles of that race, like it was just like where you were is like where you were, and like there wasn't a lot of changing that because the amount of like, at least for me, like, you know, the amount of energy to exert to like pass a few people wasn't worth, it just like wasn't
Yep.
worth it. So yeah, I had never, I mean, obviously you're right. Like for me, it didn't necessarily matter because I wasn't in the top like 10 people, but I could see how that could really make a difference, especially in elite sports. So then for you, when you're saying like, okay, like finding the woman, like the mom who's running or like this black athlete, how do you find those stories within a race? Like how are you working to kind of find those people to then talk to and share those stories?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is trying to work with other groups that are really centering those stories because they're part of those communities and giving them a platform, right? So, just
Mhm.
make like I've been very fortunate to get to make friends and have peers and colleagues that do run things like the Black Trail Runners in the UK, or got to become really good friends over the last 2 years with this woman here in the US, named Carolina, who ran Western States this year. Off of kind of a Hoka deal, and she's a Colombian immigrant, and getting to hear her story and getting to like try to find ways to give her a platform to tell her story. And then those are stories that you get to continue to follow along with. Like what like a cool moment in Western States this year is I had her on our podcast a number of months ago, and she was running Western States, and she's in an aid station, maybe in medical, getting like her foot treated or something. And the medical volunteer was like, "Oh my goodness, you're Carolina. I like heard your interview on Trail Society. Like, I'm so excited for you." And so it's these little like, I mean, we're in a niche sport, so it's all like all of a sudden like these real world meetups happen by accident all the time. But I think it's more about like paying attention to the stuff that's outside of our immediate bubble, and then finding ways to highlight and center those voices and those stories, because it's not like those stories aren't my stories, right? Like I have lived a very different life than a
Mhm.
lot of these individuals. I can't speak to their lived experience, but I get to walk through doors so much easier than a lot of those people. Like, yes, I am a white female, and being a woman is not easy in sport, but because I am a white female, doors open so much more easily to me than they do other marginalized communities. And so my job is to like hold the door open. If I'm meeting with a brand or with a group and they all of a sudden I'm like, "Oh, who should be in this meeting? So and so." Or, "Oh, who would benefit from um like like you would benefit from talking to them, they'd benefit from talking to you, so and so." And like being that person that like either is holding the door open or trying to effectively build a seat at the table for someone else is really important. And I think that there's some quote about like, you know being able to say other people's names in like a crowded room or something, where it's like not being it's not I don't a lot of people get like worried that we're like fighting for the same piece of the pie. I think, where it's like, if we're all fighting
Mhm.
for the same little tiny piece of the pie, and if I don't get it, someone else is getting it. Like, I think that that is nonsense, and it's like the goal is to make the pie bigger. And so, I can speak for what I believe in. I can speak for a small narrow thing that I hope becomes more broad. But the best thing I can do is to physically, and I guess like, so both literally and kind of metaphorically, like hold the door open for someone else to come in, for someone else to be part of that conversation and dialogue. And that is probably the most important thing we can do, just kind of broadly, to take what like we have as commonalities, is like say being women in sport, but when you add like another marginalized component to it, individuals go from being like one of few to maybe the only person on a start line, the only person in a room that looks like them or speaks like them or has their lived experience, and bringing as many of those individuals to the table as possible, I think actually represents the community of runners we see around us, right? Like I laugh all the
Mhm.
time when I'm in a meeting and it's entirely white men and like maybe another white woman, maybe. And it's like you're making decisions for a community that doesn't look just like you anymore. Like it looks like a lot of other people. And so I think my role is to like be the squeaky wheel and to hold the door open to try to make sure that those other voices and stories get centered because they're as important.
Yeah. And do you think that that's one of the barriers to entry is the fact that like people don't see people like them in the sport, or like maybe there are stories that like maybe there are is that woman that they would relate to, but yeah, like they don't, that story is not getting told, so therefore they're like, well, I can never do that because I've never seen anyone like me do
Yeah,
it.
when I've talked with people about how they got into trail running, for example, or how they got into sport, it's oftentimes because we had another mentor, right? We had someone who took us under their wing, be it a direct peer mentor, a friend, or someone older, more experienced in the sport. And so that person was your relation point. It's like, oh, so and so can do it. Maybe I can do it too. There's this idea in like psychology called self-efficacy, which is basically like your belief in your ability to do a task. And one of the ways you build self-efficacy is not just by you accomplishing the task. Like it's not just you running a 50K. So the next time you run a 50K, you know you can do it because you've done it before. It's also seeing your peers or people that are in your sphere accomplish the thing. So when your friend or your peer or your colleague or someone else in your running group, someone else you know just by happenstance runs a 50K, you say, I bet I can run a 50K too. And that, like that in and of itself, builds that self efficacy. Even though you've never run a 50K, just having that peer accomplish that thing makes you feel more confident that you can also do it. And so I do think it, like one of the barriers to entry is just not believing you can do it or not having the time and bandwidth to do it. And have like seeing other people that might be in your same circumstance, busy job, kids, lower socioeconomic status, whatever it is, having someone that you're connected to do it, I do think, even if it's just like seeing an image from, from a race where you're like, wow, like I relate to this person, know nothing about them, but I relate to this person, will I think can like tangibly bring more people into sport.
Is you do have yourself, yeah, like in a lot of different buckets. Like, how do you train for 100 miles? Like, how do you? Because I do think that is one of the biggest areas where it's that limiting belief of like, I don't have the time to do it. And so seeing someone like you who, yeah, is doing so many things and also you're running 100 milers, like, how do you find the time to do that?
I feel like I've taken lessons from my friends who have even more things on their plate. Like I'm not a parent yet, for example, but I've got friends who are parents of little ones, and they make great training partners because they have a very defined amount of time to get stuff done. They are not a minute late, and they have to be back by X time to relieve a caregiver, a significant other, etc. So it does not always look perfect, and there are definitely times of the year where I sacrifice my own training to get other things done. For example, it also means really creative. Like a long run doesn't have to happen on a Saturday for me because a Saturday might be at a race, either doing commentary, supporting an athlete, etc. And so it's like I've done a lot of like Monday long runs this year or Thursday long runs this year because it wasn't going to happen over the weekend. So recognizing that your training doesn't have to look like anyone else's training, it has to fit your life. And then I've become religious when it comes to like having my calendar make sense, and I will literally, much to my husband's chagrin, like block out things on my calendar that's like Corinne running, Corinne gym, and like trying to hold that as reality. And sometimes it gets cut off and it's like the gym falls away, generally speaking, despite the fact that the gym is a 5 minute
Mm.
walk from my house. The gym falls away if I like need to get another call in for the day. That's just like how it's going to happen. But it does. I think the biggest thing for me is that it doesn't look perfect. And I haven't been a high volume trainer this year, in part because coming back from injury for a long time. And then Also, just being really, really busy, and high volume means different things to different people. I this year have been more of like a 60 to 65 mile a week runner. Um, Historically in the past, that's probably, I was probably more of like an 80 to 90 mile a week runner. So a small step back in volume for me has been really sustainable. And then also recognizing that, yeah, I just have to be really creative. So it's like rest days are on random days, workout days are on random days. I work with a coach though too, for that very reason. Despite the fact that I'm a coach, and could in theory coach myself, it is so much nicer to like hand that responsibility off to someone else. And I make lots of notes for them because they can't read my mind. They don't know what I have going on unless I tell them. And so in Training Peaks, I'm like, this month has been chaos with travel and life and all that kind of stuff. And so it's like, I'm flying this day. I cannot train. This is what's going on this day, this day, this day. So these are probably my limitations. Or like, this would be a great, like this, I know I have enough time this day for a long run. And so he gets all those notes and he tries to figure out how to make training fit into that. And then I just have to believe and trust that we are on the same page and on the same team and we communicate well about it, because communication is a piece of that puzzle. So I would say, like, don't be afraid for your training to not look like anyone else's, because it has to fit your life, because the stress bucket can only be so full. And then I think anyone benefits from a coach, not just professional or elite athletes. My husband's a emergency medicine resident and is like not training for any events, but he also has a coach because he wouldn't do workouts if he didn't have someone saying, hey, this is the one workout we're going to try to get in this week. And this feels like a reasonable, like this feels reasonable versus this doesn't feel reasonable. So I think coaching, and anyone and everyone can benefit from coaching, because it turns out that life is like complicated and hard enough. And just giving that responsibility and that stress and that bandwidth to someone else is very helpful.
Yeah, I totally agree. I got a coach for the first time last year, and just like not having to think about my
Right?
workouts is like it just takes like a good chunk of my week, like a few hours where I'm like researching and being like, what's the best thing to do, and just like giving it to someone else. It's so nice. I've never been so consistent with like exercise and like
Yeah.
running than when I got a coach. So chances are, if you're listening to this podcast, you're someone who loves the great outdoors and pushing your limits. I want to introduce you to Flow Zone Performance Coaching, the ultimate online training platform for outdoorsy people who like to do hard things. Flow Zone Performance Coaching is designed for those who crave adventure, whether it's climbing, trail running, mountain biking, skiing, or just exploring the wild. Coach Jess specializes in preparing you for the challenges of the mountains with a unique program called FZ Mountain Fit. FZ Mountain Fit is a subscription style program designed to help you build strength, endurance, and resilience for your outdoor adventures. If you're ready to elevate your outdoor performance and join a community of like-minded adventurers, check out Flow Zone Performance Coaching today. Head over to www.fzperformance.com or at FZ Mountain Fit on Instagram to start your journey with Flow Zone Performance Coaching. Trust me, you won't regret it. Guys, if you're enjoying the show, could you do me the biggest favor? Could you spare 90 seconds out of your day? Head over to Apple Music or Spotify, give us a subscribe, give us a rating or a review. I would really appreciate it. It not only supports me, but it supports getting awesome guests on the show. Thanks a bunch. Kids, right? You're not a mom yet. I don't know if you're planning to be a mom, but I guess in the world of professional sports, I guess in the world of sports in general, there is a bit of like, I know at least for me too, there's a bit of like a nervous energy around, okay, like I want to have a kid. How does that affect your contract? Is there like anything has that been getting better?
Yeah, no, totally. And I think it's very valid. And yeah, like we would love to start a family, and we'll see, it's one of those things where it's like you don't know until you try, and maybe it's easy or maybe it's really difficult. But I do have a lot of friends and a lot of peers. I'm 34, and so a lot of my immediate peers in sport are either starting families or have kids that are maybe close to 2 years old now. I got to hang out with Rachel Drake a little bit over the weekend, and she's got a almost 2-year old, and is crushing it. And so I do think that historically women really used to get punished for getting pregnant when it came to contracts. They could cut your contract, they could not pay you, they could do all sorts of stuff to it. That has changed a lot, and we owe a lot to the likes of Alicia Montano and Allison Felix, two former track athletes. Obviously, Allison, like the most decorated track and field Olympian of all time, I want to say. Um, we owe a lot to the work that both those women did when it came to like breaking the silence around this. They put out like an amazing New York Times op-ed that came out with it. Alicia works really closely with and Mother, which they were at the Olympics this year. They helped set up a nursery at the Olympics in Paris this year. So they are the leaders in all of this. But breaking that silence did mean that contracts were evaluated more broadly and under more scrutiny, and women realized that they could ask for support during that time. That being said, it's still what women go through when it comes to becoming pregnant, starting a family during their prime athletic years is something that men don't have to deal with. Like my male
Mm-hmm.
teammates, if they have a child, they don't lose out on performance bonuses for 18 months to 2 years. They don't lose out on an ability to race or train or travel. They might cut back to support their partner, to be a dad, to help raise a small child, but they can race. They can get those bonuses. They can do those things versus my female teammates, right? Who, you're pregnant for 9-ish months, you're recovering for a year-ish, depending on how things go. That's basically 2 years of not being able to make any of your performance bonuses. So you might still get your retainer, but you might lose out on 50% of the value of your contract potentially, or more. And so
Mm-hmm.
there are like while technically, people's retainers aren't generally getting cut anymore, women still lose out in that regard. And the other piece of that puzzle is, I think comes down a lot to, like, here's a great example. Like we would like to start a family next year. Have no idea if or how or when that's going to happen. Obviously I know how the birds and the bees work, but the timeline is still up in the
Yes.
air. And so what that means though is that when I'm looking at a fall race, I was really trying to check more than one box. Keep a Western States qualifier going, keep a UTMB qualifier going. I currently have a Hard Rock qualifier that's still good for this next lottery, because lotteries are a blessing and a curse. Um, in part because I wanted to benefit from the pregnancy deferral policies. Like if I get pregnant and I'm into UTMB, I've got a 5-year pregnancy deferral policy, which means when I come back, I have an ability to be in that race. If I got into Western states, they now have a lifetime deferral policy. And that feels like maybe using the system, but at the same time, the system has been so anti women, so anti pregnant women, so anti mother for so long. It's like I wanted to capitalize on this system being put into place, which feels crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that while it has changed contractually, it's still obviously not perfect, and you have no idea how long it's going to take to come back. You have no idea if it's going to be smooth or bumpy, um, and that's just like unfortunate that we happen to hit the prime of so many things all at once. Our prime athletic years, our prime child rearing years, our prime career years are all in the same like 15-year window. And it's just like you have to pick and choose when that's going to happen and be happy no matter the outcome. But even like, when do you get pregnant during your contract, right? Like, that's a question that none of my male teammates have to figure out. Is it best to get pregnant on year 1 of your new contract? Is it best to get pregnant in year 2 of a 3-year contract so that you can hopefully race again before your contract's up so that you can resign? Um, Men don't have to think about that, but professional women in the sport who are routinely on 1 to 3 year contracts, generally 1 or 3 years. There are some 5-year contracts out there. Um, that's super stressful. And I've had teammates and friends and colleagues choose all different ways of doing it. But it is like people are actively trying to make that choice to not be penalized next contract cycle, for example, which is like super harsh.
Yeah, that's just like another thing that you don't really need to be thinking about when you're like, I want to have a child, and then being like, okay, like, is it better to have a child in February or
Yeah.
December? Like, that's yeah, that's like such a hard thing to think about. And also with, okay, like you're saying, right? You're saying that women, I mean, men too, prime athletic
Yeah.
years are like end of 20s, early 30s, I'm pretty sure.
Mhm.
Um, so talk to me a little bit about that because I think there's a big misconception on that, and a lot of people think, oh, like high school or like teenage years or early 20s. Like those are my prime. But as I've started to get more into athletics after college, I'm realizing I'm like, oh my God, I feel like way more fit than I did when I was younger. But I do think that's a common misconception. And I do think that that does keep women out of sport because they think like, well, I wasn't even athletic when I was 18. What makes me think when I'm 27 I could be athletic?
Totally. And there's actually, I was talking to one of the higher ups at Ironman at a meeting over in Europe, and he was saying that, one of the best indicators of adults doing sport is having experience as a high school athlete, having done athletics as like, 12 to 18 years old. Countries where that takes place, the US and Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Like those are places where there are high school sports. And so like
Mhm.
if we talk about getting more women into sports, it's like how do we teach a 27-year-old, a 34-year-old, a 40-year-old woman that they are athletic, that running or athletics is part of their identity because they might not have, growing up in Western Europe, in Asia, etc., not have had that athletic experience that so many like Americans and North Americans, for example, have experienced. Um, that is a difficulty. But I do think as well is that, like, speaking to your exact point of being like, oh, what if I wasn't even athletic in high school? Like, how am I supposed to be athletic now? So many people, like, you definitely don't hit your prime. I mean, your brain's not even fully formed, right, for such a long time. Until, yeah, you're in your 20s, 30s, and even into your 40s. I Two of my favorite athletes to follow right now are Lauren Puretz and Devin Yanko. Um, Honestly, Heather Jackson, like the women's master, Eden Nilsson, the Masters women's race at Western States this past year was like my favorite story, and that's 40 plus, and they destroy me. Like they absolutely destroy. They are 6, 7 years my senior, and they kick my ass. Some are moms, some aren't
Mhm.
moms, and it is like that to me is so inspiring to be like, oh my god, I've got like another 10 years, like, or more. You saw Ludo Pomeroy this year won Hard Rock, set the course record, finished fifth at UTMB. He's 49 years old. Like, that's
Yeah.
insane. And obviously, menopause for women is like a whole nother conversation. We know so little about it. It's poorly researched. We do know that like perimenopausal women, it's a big adjustment period until they kind of hit menopause. And then we know more about what to do in menopause, but that whole transition period can like just wreak havoc on people. Men
Mhm.
hit that testosterone decline like much later in life. Things are good for a longer time. Um, but I would say there are so many examples performing at such a high level, particularly in trail and ultra running, where who have either A, been in the sport for a long, long time, which is cool to see that they're still thriving and kicking butt, or they're even newer to the sport and they're hitting their stride as a 40-year-old, is super cool to see. So I would say like you've got so much time, and the likelihood of being like a 25, 26-year-old, the likelihood is that you are going to be better at 33, 34, 35 because endurance sports in particular takes you gain so much value from experience. You gain so much value from like consistency and this aerobic build over years. But the likelihood is that, yeah, people will be hitting their stride in their late 30s as opposed to being like, oh, 23 over the hill.
Okay, and also when you mentioned menopause, I was starting to think about like
Yeah.
periods during like endurance
Yeah.
sports. And that's just like a whole nother situation where like like the week before my 50K, I was like, it's gonna
Yeah.
happen. Like I'm gonna, so I like had my like cup in my backpack and I was
I'm
like,
ready.
worst comes to worst, like I'm going to have to go like into the woods and like change this. And that's like a whole nother thing that I think one maybe isn't talked about enough because I feel like I haven't heard a ton of conversation on it. And then also like just in terms of like athletic gear and like helping women prepare for stuff like that. And then like just that whole thing within a race as well is like men don't have to think
Yeah.
about that like during a
Men can
race
like
or like
pee and
during a
run at the
training
same time,
period.
right? Like they're literally peeing and running down the trail at the same time. Like they have it easy. But you're
Yeah.
right. Like and I think that the biggest thing that we can do is talk about it, right? Like the biggest thing we can do is make
Yeah.
topics like menstruation it's no longer taboo, right? Like we're flaunting our period products. Um, But I will say that, like, I don't know how many races I've done on, like, day 1 or day 2 of my period, and, like, that's always super fun. But I will say that I would way prefer day 1 or 2 of my period, particularly day 2, versus, like, 48 hours pre-period where I feel like absolute crap, where it's like, I don't want anyone to look at me, touch me, see me. I don't want my clothes to touch me. I like my everything's wrong in that time period. That being said, like, so it's super normal for people to menstruate during and around races. I think that there's probably something to be said about tapering, right? Coming off of a big training block and tapering for your race. I do feel like so many people get their period like a day or two early because of that. Um, you should be
Mhm.
proud that you're menstruating because so many people don't, and that's a sign of something being a little bit off unless you're on like a hormonal IUD and you're just not bleeding anymore because of it. Um, because we should be excited about getting our period because it means like things are working. Like our body isn't in survival mode, we
Mhm.
have fueled it well, our endocrine system is happy, we have hormones. While it is a curse in the sense that like it can be uncomfortable, we can have negative symptoms associated with it, it can be just like not very fun to like, yeah, have to carry tampons or a menstrual cup or something with you during a race, which you may or may not have to like change out during the race. um that is like not a
Mhm.
fun logistical piece of the puzzle, but at the same time it's like people, like, I think we're also getting to a point where it's like so many people didn't want their periods to come for such a long time because it's a hassle, right? And I think female athletes in particular are like like taking it back. Like the period is a thing of pride, because it means that your body is doing what it's supposed to be doing. That being said, it's still not fun. And so my biggest recommend
But especially in endurance
yes.
sports, though, because I feel like a lot of women in endurance sports do lose their
Yeah.
period because we are like exercising
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
much.
And it's like there's a lot of stuff out there now, which is amazing. Like Faster, FASTR, there's no E, Faster, which is a Stanford group, putting out a lot of really good information. Huzzah Hub, that Megan Highland and Megan Roach are running, are putting a lot of fabulous information as well. Like really easy to digest science communication, but effectively so many endurance athletes, right, like I want to say suffer from, but accidentally find themselves in a place of low energy availability. So you're just not consuming enough fuel for your activity level, which can be intentional. There are people who are intentionally in this boat, right, who are dealing with disordered eating or something of that nature. And then there are athletes who it's like you went for a 6 hour run, like you are in a caloric deficit and it is hard to make up that caloric deficit and you have to fuel yourself well. So a lot of people end up in this like state of LEA, which can become REDS or relative energy deficiency in sport. If you are chronically in this position, you can end up in that place. So it's important to kind of keep an eye on that. That's why menstruating can be like the canary in the coal mine. Like if you lose your period for an extended period of time, so let's say 3 months, you become amenorrheic. Um, that's a red flag, and you want to make sure that you're getting that evaluated because it could be intentional or otherwise. There are some other things hormonally that can mess that up. People with PCOS, for example, or endometriosis will have different menstrual symptoms that they need to look out for. But effectively, it's really hard to fuel ourselves enough. We really do need to fuel ourselves enough. And losing your period is a sign generally, not just that people used to say, oh, you're like, if you had really low body fat percentage, for example, like that was a sign that you were going to lose your period. Well, it turns out that if you have gastric bypass surgery and you cut down your caloric intake dramatically because you've had a big bowel surgery, like a big weight loss surgery, those women will also lose their periods. And it's not because their body fat percentage is too low. It is because they're calorically not getting enough fuel. And so your body shuts
Mhm.
down systems to protect itself because your body's job is to keep you alive, right? Like that is its goal. The goal is to keep you alive. And if it doesn't have enough
Mhm.
energy to do that, it's going to shut down what it calls like non mandatory functions. Like you don't need to have a baby. So, what we're going to do, because we don't have enough energy to keep you alive, is that we're going to shut down something that is energy consuming. Um, and so that like it's a red flag, and it's something that we are now talking about way more over the last couple of years. There's so much good information out there on it. And there are good physicians and good dietitians that are helping athletes do things like get their period back. So if you are listening to this and you find yourself in that boat, there are amazing resources. Kylie Van Horn is one of those dietitians out of Colorado, who specifically really works in this area. So there are resources for people. Because again, yeah, we have this cool red flag that we get to like look for and acknowledge.
For someone who, like, we kind of just talked about all the things that maybe are like a little
Yeah,
inconvenient. So for someone who maybe is like getting into it, like maybe they're not an endurance athlete, like have an inkling, they're like, okay, like I kind of want to try this. Like, what would you say to them, recommend? Like, how should they just start to just see if it's something that they're
totally. I like
interested
that
in?
you were like, we listed off all the reasons to not trail run, but what happens if we actually want more people to trail run? I feel like this happens
I know,
in
yeah.
podcasts all the time where I'm like, wow, we're really selling this sport of ours. We're like, you're gonna
Uh,
DNF
but
and
it's like part of
vomit.
the
Yeah.
process.
Um, running at the end of the day should be fun, but you can also like, get your willies out a little bit when it comes to like doing hard things. So you can get whatever you need out of running. My biggest recommendation is I think a lot of us are nervous about trail running for the first time, right? It's you're in a new location, you're in the woods, you're by yourself, you don't know how to read a map, you're not sure what to pack or bring with you. You're getting a lot of those resources from podcasts like this, right? Who are like, we're talking about like bringing snacks and like using a pack or whatnot. The next best thing you can do is to look to your like local running stores or local running clubs. A lot of towns have them. A lot of cities have them. Different iterations of them, right? From everything from local 3 mile runs from the running shop to bigger group runs that might leave like start from a trailhead, for example, or at a minimum you might meet someone at one of those run clubs, not to date because I heard they're a dating group now, but to like say, oh, like I'm also interested in trail running, or oh, you're a trail runner, I would love to trail run, like now I can carpool with you, now you're going to show me the ropes a little bit. I do think that getting out on the trail with other people, with a friend, with a new friend, with a couple people, is such a great way to experience the sport, to grow, to become more a part of it. Local, low key trail races too, because there are like very intense ones. And then there's generally like local ones that are like very chill and very fun. Volunteering at them is a great way to meet people. Signing up for the shortest distance there, be it a 5K, for example, is a great way to like test the waters and again, meet people. I think making friends as an adult is super hard. You're not in college
Mhm.
anymore, right? It's not like, oh, you are my forced friend because we're in college classes together, or we live in the dorms together, or your friend is my friend. So I do think that run clubs, run groups, shoe demos, whatever might be going on at a local running store is a great way to like have that first connection, make that first friend, meet all their trail friends, go for a bigger group run, and recognize too that like you don't have to be the fastest person there. You can like, I'm like a jogger at heart. And I think it's important to recognize that there will be people of all, like from all walks of life, all speeds, all abilities at a lot of these group runs, and don't feel pressure to like be at the front. And if you're not at the front, it doesn't matter. Like I would go to the San Francisco Running Company group runs, and I hated the front of the run because it was like just a battle. It was like the most competitive non-race I'd ever been in. And so generally I would find a person that I'd want to run with that day and like I'd run their speed. I'd run whatever they wanted to run type of thing. And it didn't matter that, our other friends or people we knew were finishing 30 minutes before us type of thing, because that wasn't the point of the run for us, for me, etc. So I'm a big fan of looking for that local group run, looking for that local run club. A lot of race organizations will also put
Mhm.
on like preview runs, for example. Like they do that with Gorge Waterfalls in Portland. Um, Man, if we have any Canadians listening, Gary Robbins does such a good job up in Canada, putting on like preview runs. He calls them orientation runs of their race courses. You don't have to be signed up for the race to go to these things, right? It's just an opportunity to meet other trail runners, to get out on a kind of a guided run, to hang out with people in the parking lot afterwards. Like those are where the big wins happen. So I'm definitely a big fan of sending people to group activities, just because you're bound to meet someone there that you connect with.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. And so to kind of like wrap up the podcast, something I like to ask everyone at the end of the podcast is there a piece of advice that you've gotten, and it doesn't have to be running related, it can be anything. Is there just a piece of advice that you've gotten in your life that has just stuck with you, that you could share with us?
Totally. I got the best piece of advice, compliment. I mean, I've gotten a bunch, but this year recently, like went through kind of a hard time, end of June into early July, just with a number of things. And one of my dear friends texted me and she said, don't let anyone tell you who you are because you know who you are. And it's this idea that like, I'm all for like criticism, but it's like, don't let people assume they know anything about you or who you are, like, because you know who you are, you know what you're about, you know what you're doing. Um, and that was like very, at that moment, very affirming to like, I felt like I was like banging my head against the wall a little bit, which happens a lot. And you're like, why am I doing this thing? Why am I involved in X, Y, or Z thing? But yeah, just that reminder that like a person sees you and like they know what you're doing and they know what you're about, and like no one else can really take that from you. So I would say that that can be translated to your job, your running, your whatever it is. Like at the end of the day, like you know who you are, and that kind of becomes that most important guiding light.
Yeah, well, I love that. Thank you so much for coming on the
Thanks for
podcast.
having me. This was super. I knew it took a long time for us to get this all put together, but thanks for having me.
And that's a wrap on today's Dose of Confidence. Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode. If you found inspiration here, why not share it with a friend? Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and sign up for our newsletter so you don't miss an episode. Sending lots of love your way. Until next time, this is Becca, encouraging you to live your boldest life.